Eleanor Ward, Duchess of Regency, signed her name to the papers with the same steady hand she had used to balance the Thorncliffe accounts for 2 years, and did not weep. She did not ask the solicitor to wait until morning. She did not ask where her husband was. She set down the pen, blotted the ink with the corner of a cloth the midwife had left folded on the nightstand, and looked past the man standing at the foot of her bed to the 2 small, furious faces already swaddled and waiting in Mrs. Colby's arms. "Peter," she said, touching the smaller of the 2 beneath the chin. "For my father." Then the other, whose cry was louder, whose fist had already found its way free of the blanket. "Simon, for his father before him." She said it plainly, the way she might have read out a column of figures, and the solicitor, a thin man named Duffield, who had clearly been told to be quick and had not been told to expect this, stood holding his hat in both hands, and did not write anything down, because there was nothing left in his instructions that covered a woman who agreed to everything and asked for nothing. There was a strip of ivory ribbon on the nightstand beside the blotted ink, worn soft at both ends, the last remnant of her mother's christening gown, and Eleanor's fingers found it without her eyes moving from the papers. She did not tie it around anything yet. She only held it, the way a person holds the one object in a room they are certain is theirs. By morning she would be gone from Thorncliffe, and it would be the better part of a year before the Duke of Regency understood what he had traded for a single afternoon's certainty. The autumn of 1814 had come to that part of the county the way it always did, heavy with cut hay and indifferent to the households beneath it. And it was in that ordinary weather that Eleanor Ward had married Julian Thorne, 6th Duke of Regency, in a ceremony attended by 11 people, and no affection that anyone troubled to name aloud. It was, both families agreed, a sensible arrangement. Her father, the Reverend Peter Ward, had been dead 8 months, and had left her a small, sound cottage, and no money. The Duke needed a wife with a clear head, clean bloodlines, and no interest in London, since he had buried 2 engagements already under the weight of exactly that interest. Eleanor had a clear head. She had, in fact, the clearest head in 3 parishes, though almost no one, but her father's parishioners, had ever had reason to learn it. She managed Thorncliffe's household accounts within 4 months of her marriage, quietly, correcting a housekeeper's arithmetic here, a steward's miscount there, never in front of anyone, always by way of a note left where it would be found and credited to no one. She learned the tenant rolls before the Duke's own land agent did. She kept a private ledger, not of money, but of small facts, which cottage roof leaked, which widow's rent was 3 weeks behind because her son was ill and not because she was idle, which servant deserved raising, and which deserved only patience. None of it was asked of her. All of it got done. Julian Thorne noticed almost none of this, not because he was cruel, but because he had been raised by a father who taught him, without ever quite saying it in those words, that a duke's household ran on competence the way a clock ran on its spring, invisibly, and that a man who went about admiring the spring aloud was a fool who did not understand what a clock was for. Julian had absorbed the lesson entirely. He was polite to his wife. He was correct with his wife. He did not know, in any way he could have named under oath, that she had saved him £1,100 in her first winter alone. She overheard him once, in the 2nd month of her marriage, through the half-open door of his study, speaking to his cousin Edmund Thorne, Lord Cray, who had been heir presumptive to the dukedom for 11 years before Eleanor's wedding ring made him merely a cousin again. "She is suitable," Julian had said, in the flat, unhurried voice he used for decisions already made. That is all a wife needs to be. Eleanor had stood in the corridor a moment, her hand flat against the cold plaster, and had not gone in. She had filed it instead, the way she filed everything that cost too much to feel all at once, into the drawer of herself she kept for exactly such remarks, and she had gone down to correct the dairy accounts. Because the milk yields did not care what her husband thought a wife needed to be. Edmund Thorne had smiled at that remark of his cousin's, the particular smile of a man rehearsing patience he does not feel, and had said nothing that evening that anyone could later hold against him. That was the shape Edmund preferred his patience to take. He was warmest, always, when he was most dangerous, and in the autumn of 1814 he was already dangerous, because 11 years is a long time to be the answer to a question, and Eleanor Ward had just become a better one. The pregnancy, when it came a year later, was announced at dinner in 4 sentences and celebrated with a single additional bottle of wine. Julian was, in his own contained way, glad of it. An air settled things. It settled Edmund's long patience into something with an actual expiration date, and everyone at that table understood the arithmetic, even though no one spoke it aloud. Eleanor carried through that winter with the same unremarked competence she brought to everything else, running the household from a chair by the fire when her feet swelled past the point of standing, correcting a bad delivery of seed grain from her bed by dictation, and waiting, without particular anxiety, for a single child to arrive sometime near the new year. She did not know yet that there would be 2. She did not know that Edmund Thorne had already begun, quietly, the work of making sure that whatever arrived would not matter, and that the instrument he had chosen to do it with was not a blade or a bribe or anything so honest as a bribe, but a piece of paper, written in a hand disturbingly close to her own. The letter arrived at Thorncliffe on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of January, delivered to Julian directly by his cousin's own hand, and it was, on its face, a small thing, 2 paragraphs, unsigned, purporting to be a copy of a note from the Duchess to her land steward, Tom Hale, arranging to meet him at the Old Folly on a night the Duke had been in London. The language was warm in a way that estate business did not require. The hand was close enough to Eleanor's looping, upright script that a man who loved his wife might have known it instantly for a forgery, and a man who had spent 2 years admiring her usefulness instead of her face did not know it at all. Julian read it twice, standing in his study with the fire dying behind him, and felt the floor of himself give way in a manner he recognised. He had felt it once before, at the age of 7, watching his mother's carriage go down the Thorncliffe drive and not come back, and hearing his father say, in the same flat voice Julian himself would later inherit, that some women simply could not be made to stay useful for long. He had built a whole life on the theory that if he never asked anything of anyone that they could betray him for, no one would have the opportunity. He had married a woman he did not love specifically, so that this could never happen to him again. And here, in 2 unsigned paragraphs, was the proof that it had happened anyway, that it was always going to happen, that a man could choose the most suitable woman in 3 parishes and it would not matter, because the failing was never in the choosing, it was in him. He did not go to her. He would tell himself later that he meant to, that he only needed a day to think, and that the day had gotten away from him the way days do when a man is afraid of what he will find at the end of them. What he did instead, on the Thursday, was send for Duffield, his solicitor, and instruct him to draw papers of separation, with a clause disavowing any claim to whatever child or children the Duchess was carrying, and to have them ready within the week. Word came from Mrs. Colby, the midwife, on the following Monday that the Duchess's pains had started early, 2 weeks before anyone had reckoned, and that it looked, from the size and the manner of it, as though there might be more than one child coming. Julian Thorne did not ride to his wife's door. He sent to Field instead, with the papers, and rode to London the same afternoon, telling himself he was giving her privacy, telling himself many things, none of which he would be able to say aloud to another living person for the better part of a year. De Field stood at the foot of the bed, while Eleanor laboured, and he was, whatever else could be said of him, ashamed enough to wait until the worst of it had passed, and the boys were both breathing before he laid the papers before her. She read them once, by the low lamp Mrs. Colby held for her, her face doing nothing at all, not the pinch of injury, not the flush of temper, nothing a servant standing in the doorway could have carried downstairs as a story. She read the clause disavowing the children twice. Then she asked, in a voice roughened only by labour and not by anything else, for the pen. Mrs. Colby, who had delivered half the parish and buried a husband of her own without a single public tear, watched the girl she had known since infancy sign away a marriage with the same hand she used to balance a household ledger, and said nothing until the ink was dry, because she understood, better than the solicitor did, that there are moments a woman must be allowed to get through without company. "You'll want to rest, Mrs." Colby said finally. "I will rest," Eleanor said, "for exactly 20 minutes. Then I will need the shawl and the small trunk and someone to send word to Ivy Cottage that I am coming home." She counted the 20 minutes. She did not cry through them, though her jaw worked once, hard, and her hand found the ribbon on the nightstand and held it the way another woman might have held a hand that wasn't there. At the end of the 20 minutes she asked for the shawl. Ivy Cottage had belonged to her father, and it stood 2 miles beyond the edge of the Thorncliffe boundary. Small and sound, and entirely her own in a way nothing at Thorncliffe had ever been. Mrs. Colby came with her, on the understanding that a woman who had just delivered twins in the depths of January had no business managing alone, and stayed on afterward in a manner neither of them ever formally arranged, becoming housekeeper, nurse, and the nearest thing to family Eleanor had left standing. It was a poor household by ducal standards, and a rich one by every measure Eleanor had actually been taught to value. There was a kitchen garden gone to seed under the last tenant, a roof that wanted mending in one corner, and £400 a year settled on her by a marriage contract that Edmund Thorne, in his hurry to see her ruined, had somehow overlooked disputing. She did not spend the first month grieving what she had lost. She spent it walking the garden with Simon strapped to her chest, and Peter asleep in a basket by the door, working out. In her head, and then on paper, exactly what £400 and 40 acres of half-neglected land could be made to do. By March she had let 2 of the fallow fields to a family of tenants turned out from a harsher landlord 3 parishes over, on terms so plain and so fair that the wife of the family, a stout, suspicious woman named Prudence Marsh, came to the cottage door a week later, not to complain, but to ask whether the Duchess, she still called her that, out of habit and a certain defiant respect, took in mending, because she had never in her life had a landlord who wrote out the terms of a lease, in words a farmer's wife could actually read without a lawyer standing over her. "I do not take in mending," Eleanor told her, holding the door open with Simon on her hip. "But I would welcome you at market on Thursdays, if you'd walk with me. 2 women are safer than one, and I find I am short a friend just now." Prudence Marsh became the first person in the county to say, aloud and in front of others, that the Duchess of Rensley had more sense in her little finger than most men had in the whole of themselves, and it was Prudence who carried that opinion to the baker, and the baker who carried it, embellished, to the miller, so that by summer the story moving through Malstead was not the one Edmund Thorne had paid to have circulated. Tom Hale came to Ivy Cottage in April, hat in his hands, to say that he had heard what letter had been used against her, and that he meant to clear his own name and hers both, whatever it cost him in his position. He was a plain man, land steward at Thorncliffe for 6 years, married, entirely uninterested in duchesses, beyond the professional respect a good steward owes a landowner who understands drainage. He had never written to her in his life about anything but ditches and fences, and he said so, flatly, the hat turning once in his hands. "I believe you," Eleanor said. "I have always believed you. The letter was never about you, Mr. Hale, and it was never really about me. It was about who stood to gain if I were gone." "Lord Cray," Tom said. It was not a question. Lord Cray, she agreed, and something in her voice, dry and unhurried, made Tom Hale laugh once despite himself, a short bark of a laugh that surprised them both. She did not go to Julian. She did not write to him. She built the garden, and the lease terms, and a small trade in preserved fruit that she and Prudence Marsh's 2 daughters put up every autumn and sold as far as the county town, and within a year Ivy Cottage was, by every practical measure, thriving, while Thorncliffe, 3 miles distant, sat under a silence its owner had chosen, and could not now seem to undo. Word of her reached Julian the way water finds its way downhill, without asking permission of anyone in its path. His steward mentioned, in the ordinary course of an estate report, that the Marsh family had taken up new terms at Ivy Cottage, and were paying on time for the first occasion in memory. A tenant's wife, thanking him for nothing in particular, mentioned that her boy had been given a place learning the preserving trade with the Duchess's household, and had come home with wages in his pocket for the first time in his young life. His own housekeeper, a woman not given to opinions, observed once, unprompted, that Ivy Cottage's kitchen garden had put out more produce in 1 season than Thorncliffe's had in 3, and did not need to say what she meant by it. Julian rode past the lane to Ivy Cottage twice that spring, and did not turn down it either time. He told himself the second time that he had simply been going to market. He knew, by the 3rd time, that this was a lie he was telling only himself, and that the particular silence of a man doing arithmetic he dislikes had settled over him the way frost settles over a field that has not yet decided whether it will thaw. It was his old tutor, a Mr. Anselm long retired to a cottage on the estate's edge, who finally said to him what no one else at Thorncliffe would risk saying to a duke. Anselm had taught Julian his letters, and more usefully, had watched Julian's mother's carriage go down the drive on the same afternoon Julian had watched it. From a different window. "You are afraid," Anselm said without preamble, over a chessboard neither of them was truly attending to, "that if you love a thing, it will be taken from you. So you have arranged never to love anything you could not first classify as merely useful. It is a tidy arrangement, Your Grace. It has cost you a wife and 2 sons, and I do not think you have finished paying for it yet." Julian did not answer that directly. He moved a pawn he did not need to move, and said, after a silence that went on rather longer than the game required, "She never once asked me to love her." "No," Anselm agreed. "She built herself a life instead, so that she would never have to ask anyone for anything again. That is not the same as not wanting it, Your Grace. It is only what a clever woman does, while she is waiting to see whether wanting it is safe." Edmund Thorne, watching this same season of rumour from Thorncliffe's edges, understood that his cousin's silence would not hold forever, and that a duchess thriving at Ivy Cottage with 2 healthy sons was a slower and more complete threat to him than any scandal. Because scandal fades, and a woman who cannot be discredited does not. He moved, that summer, to make certain she could not simply be forgiven and folded back in without a fight. He began quietly securing affidavits, a maid willing to swear she had seen letters passed at the Folly, a stable boy paid to remember a meeting that had never occurred, building, with the same patience he had spent 11 years perfecting, a case that the separation ought to be made permanent by law, and the boys placed under guardianship other than their mothers, on the grounds that a woman who had signed away her own marriage without argument had plainly known herself guilty. He did not know, as he built it, that the clerk he had hired to copy Eleanor's hand for the original letter, a nervous young man named Perkins with a wife of his own, and a debt of £20 he could not otherwise have cleared, had kept, out of a habit older than his fear, a private note of what he had been asked to do, and what he had been paid for doing it. The midpoint of that year arrived not as a twist, but as a door opening. Julian came to Ivy Cottage himself, in September unannounced, and stood in the garden among the last of the season's beans, while Eleanor knelt 3 rows away, with Peter propped against her hip, and did not immediately rise to greet him. "I did not come here to ask you back," he said. It was, she would think later, the first entirely honest sentence he had said to her since their wedding. "Good," she said, "because I would not have come." She stood then, unhurried, brushing soil from her skirt. "Say what you came to say, Your Grace." "I have preserves to see to before the light goes." He told her, standing among the beans with his hat in his hands the way Tom Hales had turned in his own months before. About the letter, about his mother's carriage, about the particular arithmetic of a boy who decides it is safer never to need anyone than to be left by someone he needed. He did not call it an apology, and she did not let him, when he tried once to call it that. "That is an explanation," she said. "I asked for an apology months ago, when I asked for nothing, because I had already stopped expecting one. Do not confuse the two now that it is convenient. I will hear the explanation. The apology is a different appointment, and you have not yet earned the hour." "Then tell me what would earn it," he said. "Show me," she said. "Not tonight, and not with words. Show me over time, the way a debt is paid, in instalments, whether or not anyone is watching to see you make them." She reached into her apron pocket then, where she had taken to keeping the ribbon since the night the boys were born, and untied a short length of it, holding it out to him, not the whole of it, only enough to prove she had cut something free and given it, deliberately, into his keeping. "That is not forgiveness," she said. "It is only proof that I have not decided against you yet." He took it, and did not know, holding it, that it was the first object of any value she had willingly placed in his hands in 2 years of marriage. The evidence that would end Edmund Thorne's long patience arrived at Ivy Cottage in October, carried not by triumph, but by conscience. Perkins came himself, in the evening, having heard through the same channels that carried everything eventually through Marlstead, that the Duchess was assembling something against Lord Cray, and that a man who had done a wrong might still choose, before it was too late, to be the one who ended it, rather than merely the one caught in it. He laid his private note on Eleanor's kitchen table, dates, sums, the specific instruction to copy the loop of her Y from the dairy ledgers Edmund had borrowed on a pretext 18 months before, and he did not ask for mercy so much as simply admit, in a voice that broke twice and started again both times, that he had a wife and a debt, and had not, until it was already done, understood what the letter would be used to justify. "I kept the note," he said, "because I thought someday I might need to prove I had not wanted to do it. I did not think it would be so soon." Eleanor read it through twice, the way she read everything that mattered, and set it beside the ribbon, still cut short from where she had given a length of it away. "You will testify to this," she said, before Mr. Whitfield, "if it comes to a hearing." "I will," Perkins said, and something in his shoulders came down, the particular relief of a man who has been carrying a weight so long he had forgotten it was possible to set it anywhere. Edmund Thorne's counterstroke, when it came, was not subtle so much as desperate, the move of a man who felt the ground shifting, and reached for the nearest solid thing, regardless of what it cost him. He petitioned the county magistrate directly for a hearing on the guardianship of the twin heirs, citing the signed separation papers as proof the Duke himself had, at the time, disclaimed them, and arguing that a mother who had agreed to such terms without contest could hardly be trusted with the raising of a future duke and his brother. He had, by then, 3 affidavits, a clerk's forged letter, and 11 years of patience behind him, and he believed, with the particular confidence of a man who has never once been made to answer for anything, that it would be enough. Eleanor received notice of the hearing on a grey morning in late October, read it standing at her own kitchen table with Peter asleep against her shoulder, and said only to Mrs. Colby, "Then we will need the ribbon after all," and went to fetch the papers she had spent a year quietly gathering. The hearing was held at Marlstead's Town Hall on the 2nd Tuesday of November, and by the appointed hour the room held more of the county than the business of a single guardianship dispute ought reasonably to have drawn. Tenants, tradesmen, the miller and the baker, and Prudence Marsh with both daughters, all of them come, ostensibly on other errands, and all of them finding, once arrived, that they had time to stay and watch. Mr. Whitfield, the presiding magistrate, was a precise, unhurried man who had ruled on boundary disputes and disputed wills for 30 years, and had long since stopped being impressed by anyone's title. Edmund Thorne presented his case first, composed, warm, entirely reasonable in tone, laying his affidavits before the bench one at a time, as though setting out cutlery. Eleanor rose when it was her turn, and did not raise her voice. She laid the forged letter on the table beside a sample of her own hand from the Thorncliffe dairy ledgers, side by side, and invited Mr. Whitfield to examine the loop of the Y in each. "They are close," she said. "They are not the same. A close copy is not a signature, Mr. Whitfield. It is a confession of effort." Then she called Perkins, who stood, pale but steady, and told the room in a voice that shook only at the start what he had been asked to do, and for how much, and by whom, and laid his own private note beside the letter, as proof he had kept the record before anyone had asked him to produce it. Tom Hale testified next, plainly, that he had never in 6 years' service written a private word to the Duchess of Rensley that was not about ditches, drainage, or the state of offence, and that he would swear it on whatever the court required, because his own wife and children deserved a husband whose name meant something in this county. It was Tom Hale's wife, uninvited and unbidden, who rose from the gallery at the end of his testimony and said, into the room's sudden quiet, that she had known her husband 12 years, and that any woman fool enough to accuse him of romance had never once watched him try to compose a letter about anything. The room's laughter was brief, but it broke something loose in the air, and Eleanor, watching it happen, understood that the county had already begun, without being told to recalibrate what it believed of her. Edmund Thorne's composure held through the letter, and through Perkins, and cracked only when Mr. Whitfield asked him, in the same unhurried voice he had used all morning, precisely where the £20 paid to Perkins had come from, and asked to see the estate ledger in which such a sum might have been recorded. Edmund had not thought, in 11 years of patience, that anyone would ask to see his own paper. He had spent so long weaponizing other people's that he had forgotten his own could be read the same way. He opened his mouth to answer, and something behind his composed and warm and reasonable face simply went out, the way a lamp goes out when the wick has finally burned through what little oil was left. Mr. Whitfield ruled that afternoon that the guardianship petition was dismissed, that the separation instrument had been procured under material deception and was void from its signing, and that Lord Cray's conduct would be referred to the appropriate authorities for whatever further reckoning the law required. He did not sentence Edmund Thorne to anything more theatrical than that. And Eleanor, when it was her turn to speak on the matter of consequence, did not ask for more. "I could ask that he be ruined entirely," she said, to the room, to Edmund, to her husband standing near the back with his hat in his hands, the way it seemed half the men in this story eventually held their hats. "I have the documents to do it. I will not. Let him keep the small annuity his father left him, and let him leave this county, and let that be the whole of his punishment, because I would rather be known as a woman who could have destroyed a man and chose instead to simply be done with him." Edmund Thorne left Malstead within the month, and was not seen in that county again, and the last anyone reported of him was that he had grown quiet in a way 11 years of patience had never once made him, the quiet of a man who has finally run out of paper to hide behind. Julian came to Ivy Cottage 3 days after the hearing, and this time he did not stand among the beans. He sat at her kitchen table, at her invitation, and gave her the explanation in full. Not the abbreviated version from the garden in September, but the whole of it. His mother's carriage, his father's flat voice. The 2 engagements broken before hers, that had taught him it was safer to expect nothing than to be disappointed in something he had allowed himself to want. And the letter, and the particular cowardice of sending Duffield rather than coming himself, because a man who does not appear cannot be refused to his face. "That is the explanation," Eleanor said, when he had finished. "I have heard it. Now I require the apology, and they are not the same, and I will know the difference if you try to give me the first again dressed as the second." He was quiet a moment. Then, plainly, without the flattened voice he used for decisions already made, he said, "I am sorry. Not that it happened to me. That I did it to you. I sent papers to a woman in childbed because it was easier than looking at her, and there is no explanation that makes that anything other than a wrong I chose." "All right," Eleanor said. "All right," he said then. "All right," she said again, and something in the room settled, the way a house settles after a long frost finally breaks, and that was the whole of the treaty for that day. Her conditions, when she itemized them, were not many, but she said each one aloud, the way she might read out clauses of a lease. Her authority over the boys' upbringing, their names, their education, would be hers absolutely, and would not be revisited by him, nor by any future Thorne. Her own income and the cottage would remain hers, regardless of what came after, settled in writing, not in sentiment. He would never again communicate anything that mattered to her through any paper he had not first said to her face. And if he wished to return to Thorncliffe as her husband in more than name, it would be on ordinary days, proved in ordinary ways, not in a single grand gesture that let him feel forgiven cheaply. He agreed to every clause, and asked for only one exception, that he be allowed, once publicly, at whatever gathering she chose, to say aloud what he had once said privately, so that the whole county might hear it undone. She granted him that. What followed was not courtship so much as apprenticeship. He came to Ivy Cottage 3 afternoons a week through that winter, and learned, without being taught, which of his sons woke easiest, and which needed to be walked, which cried at the cold, and which only at hunger. He sat with the household ledger Eleanor kept, and found, to his own quiet shame, that she had been correcting his estate's arithmetic since her 2nd month of marriage without once being thanked for it, and he thanked her for it now, plainly, at the kitchen table, in front of Mrs. Colby, who allowed herself the smallest, most satisfied nod of her life. There was one relapse. In February, faced with a decision about which physician ought to be engaged for the boy's coming inoculation, Julian did what 2 years of habit had trained him to do. He wrote a letter, addressed it to Eleanor, and had it delivered by a servant, rather than simply asking her over supper. She read it, set it down, and looked at him across the table where he sat, having arrived an hour later to see the boys, entirely unaware of what he had done. "You wrote to me," she said, "about our sons, instead of asking me. Do you know what that is, Julian?" He went very still. "It is the old habit," he said slowly. "It is exactly the old habit." "It is," she agreed. "I am not angry. I am telling you plainly, because that is the agreement, and because I would rather you correct it now, in a kitchen, than have it grow back into something larger later. Then I am asking you," he said, now aloud, "which physician?" "Dr. Ames," she said. "And Julian, thank you for hearing it the first time I said it." It was Mrs. Colby's blunt observation, offered without being asked, that told Eleanor the thaw had reached somewhere real, that she had heard the Duke laugh, actually laugh, at something one of the boys had done with a spoon, and that it had not sounded rehearsed. The declaration, when it finally came, arrived on an ordinary evening in March. No anniversary, no occasion, only the two of them at the kitchen table after the boys were down, the ribbon, the whole length of it, restored, for he had kept his portion safe through the entire winter and returned it to her that night, retired resting between them on the wood. "I would choose you," Julian said. "I have been choosing you, in fact, for some months now, in 100 small ways I hope you have noticed. And I intend to go on choosing you for the whole of whatever time I am given, whether or not you ever again let me forget how nearly I threw it away." "I noticed," Eleanor said, "every one." And she reached across the table and took his hand, which was for 2 people who had spent a year and a half learning each other properly for the first time, declaration enough. 2 years later, in the spring, Peter and Simon Thorne were christened at last in the Malstead parish church their grandfather had once served, their gowns tied at the collar, with a strip of ivory ribbon, so worn soft with handling that the seamstress had commented on it, not knowing it had once been signed away in a sick room and carried back, cut and mended and restored, through a hearing. A garden, a kitchen table, and a whole ordinary winter of proof. Thorncliffe's tenants that year were the first in the county, paid a fair wage posted openly on the estate office door, in Eleanor's own hand, a practice her husband maintained, without being asked a second time. Ivy Cottage's preserving trade, begun with 2 rows of overgrown fruit trees and a widow's stubbornness, employed 11 women of the parish by then, and had not once, in 2 years, missed a payment. The house at Thorncliffe, which had held its breath for the better part of a marriage, was said by more than one visitor to feel, now, like a house that had finally exhaled. She had stopped asking to be seen. She had made herself, instead, entirely impossible to unsee. Not through the ruin of the man who had once called her merely suitable, but through the plain, accumulating evidence of a life built without waiting for anyone's permission to matter. It was not because she forgave easily that the marriage survived. It was because she required, before it could survive at all, that the difference between an explanation and an apology be honoured, and that mercy be dispensed only from a position strong enough to have withheld it. She had signed away a marriage once, without a single tear, and named her sons herself, in a room where no one had asked her opinion, because she had already understood the one thing her husband would take a year longer to learn, that being useful and being loved are not the same inheritance, and that only one of them, in the end, is worth signing your name to twice.